All right, so I'm a neuroscientist by trade. I study the evolution of the brain, the neural control of behavior, and recently I have a theory about neuroscientists. They all turn weird, and they all end up studying strange things that we don't understand, like consciousness and empathy and kindness. I mean, Francis Crick, who discovered the helical nature of the DNA, his last 3 papers were on consciousness. And I became really interested in this. And I was actually interested initially in hatred. Why do we hate? And there's reasons why that kind of became a problem. First of all, somebody studies, what do you study? I said, well, I study pain and hate. And they kind of stare at you pretty funny. And then I found out the science of hate is kind of difficult, because hate turns out to be the lack of happy. And so I started studying the science of happy. And I started studying meditation and mindfulness, and it turned out to be pretty cool. And so the title of this talk is called The Empathetic Eve. And the idea is that, and let's say you got a football game tomorrow, you got a bunch of friends over, and somebody says, all right, should we have chicken wings or pizza? I'm going to go out. And you say, why do we care? But that's not how I think about it. As a scientist, I'm actually not interested in that part. I'm actually interested in, why do we care? And the science of caring. And I'm going to suggest to you that empathy and caring is innate and is part of the survival of oneself and a species as a whole. And it predates the Anthropocene, the origin of the humans and the primates, and is innate in the fundamentals of biological evolution. There's a couple dates I'm going to suggest to you guys up there. Oh, the laser pointer does work. One is about 1 billion years ago, which is the origin of microbes and bacteria. The other one's going to become kind of important, is about 700 million years ago. And I'm going to suggest that's where empathy came from. So there's lots of words for this. We can call it empathy, compassion, whatever. There are folks that will argue very strongly that empathy and caring only exists in humans and non-human primates. It's very difficult for me to imagine that critters, and those are my 2 daughters there, Emma and Sophia, I don't remember which one's which, they both come when called. It's pretty hard for me to imagine that Emma doesn't adore her big sister. And there's tremendous data out there, even recently. And when I looked for empathy with a Google image search, which of course is what everybody does, I thought that was really beautiful. And now I'm not sure that's polar bears choking each other out. But there is a tremendous evidence recently that even in socialized fishes, that there is empathy and compassion. And I think the behaviorists kind of waffled a bit, because they don't call it empathy, they call it emotional contagion. Trust me, you Google image search for fish contagion, you don't get that picture. But the data suggests that there is a huge evolutionary preponderance for reducing the suffering for others and oneself. And I'm going to suggest to you guys, and this came out literally 2 weeks ago in a paper that I wrote, and it dates back about 700 million years. All right, I'm a neurobiologist by trade. Here's a brain, here's a human brain, here's all the wrinkly crap on the outside. The purple are receptor areas for the binding of hormones. A receptor is nothing but binds a neurotransmitter, binds a hormone. And all of this originates from inside in an area we call the midbrain, and then there's the spinal cord coming down. And this is the origin of a hormone that I'm going to talk about a little bit more about, called oxytocin. If you look at any clinical physiology book, it calls it the hormone of pregnancy. It was originally discovered in 1906 by, ironically, a guy whose last name was Love, which is so beautiful. And it causes contraction of certain muscles, relaxation of others. It causes the contraction of the uterus when you're giving birth. It causes the contraction of the myoepithelial cells when the mother is breastfeeding, and it also activates this pathway that's known as the reward pathway. It's activated by a couple hormones, serotonin, a little bit of vasopressin, but primarily oxytocin, and it gives a reward. And it makes evolutionary sense that, now, obviously I've never breastfed a child, but it kind of makes sense evolutionarily that mom's kind of okay with a kid being healthy and living by breastfeeding off of her, right? So it kicks in this reward system, and it makes us happy. And that genome for oxytocin, which for those of you that have had organic chemistry, that I've probably just ticked in post-traumatic stress disorder from that image, is believed to be about 700 million years old. Microbes exhibit this genome. And as you can obviously tell, that's a pretty happy cow. So, my point is, we're born to care. Our job is don't screw it up. I came to the realization after I was really interested in studying hate, hate's kind of the default after we get rid of caring. And it's there. Yeah, there's my daughters again. I'm tremendously biased. So, this talk originated about 2.5 years ago by two things. About the sixth time, I know I'm not supposed to walk too far from the rug. About the sixth time I watched Stanley Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey, beautiful, beautiful movie, I realized the movie was all about compassion and empathy. It took me a while to get to the end of that movie and figure that out. And the second one was my kid. And she said, Pa, first of all, there's lots of dads out there. Pa is wicked cool to be called. She said, does petting my dog make me happy? And I said, let's test it, because Pa has cool tools. And so we measured it. Sure enough, if you read to a dog, you pet a dog, it drops your heart rate, it drops your blood pressure, increases your saturated oxygen content, easily measurable. Later on, we figured out it also increases oxytocin levels, the reward center. It makes you happy. And then she said, Pa, is the dog happy? And I said, let's test that as well. Sure enough, when you pet a dog, it decreases the dog's heart rate, the dog's blood pressure, the dog's increases pulse oximetry, and increases oxytocin level. So she won the science fair project with the title of her poster being, Every Human Needs a Dog and Every Dog Needs a Human. Now, I get asked this question all the time. Does it work with cats? And my answer has always been, you put a blood pressure cuff on a cat and tell me. So I can't definitively say that's true. But if we go back and look at the science, which is what I'm ultimately interested in, there is a hormone called calcitriol, which comes from the parathyroid gland, which surrounds the thyroid. Oops, I'm in the zone. I'm not supposed to cross this line where it overmodulates. And it's actually what's called a prohormone. We call it vitamin D. It's not actually a vitamin. It's a prohormone, which gets converted into cholecalciferol. Who cares? You add that to sunshine with ultraviolet B, and you get oxytocin. We get the happy hormone. Then, 700 million years ago, this bacteria, hang on, Lactobacillus, I got it right, reuteri, produces the genome for oxytocin receptors. We don't know for sure yet if it actually produces oxytocin, but why in the world would you produce receptors if you're not producing the hormone? I asked a buddy of mine yesterday about this, and he said, oh my gosh, we're looking at an NIH grant, let's start. So you may be hearing something kind of important here soon. We're going to look at this. But if that bacteria is present in the human gut microbiome, and I tell my students, within 4 or 5 years, I'll bet you money there's going to be a Nobel Prize for the human gut microbiome. We don't appreciate what's inside well enough. But if that bacteria is present in the human gut, we get more oxytocin receptors. So now we have more oxytocin receptors, we have more oxytocin, we get happy. It's pretty cool. Is it ridiculously simplistic? Yes. But what if we're right? So, you got any data to suggest this silly idea has any merit? Why, actually, I do believe I have. My background, I was 2 credits away from finishing my second PhD, and I dropped out because I refused to take 2 more statistics classes. I'm sorry, math ain't my specialty. If I need stats, I hire a statistician. But my research is all on the science of meditation and mindfulness. Walter Cannon, in 1932, published a beautiful, beautiful textbook called The Wisdom of the Body. And in it, he coined the phrase homeostasis. When people ask me what I do, I tell them I'm a physiologist. I love that because the Greek root word physios means nature. I study nature. How cool is that, right? And they'll say, well, what kind of physiology? And I study homeostasis. Homeostasis, homeo means the same, stasis means the state. I study why we keep things the same way. When I work night shifts as an EMT, we worry about that. If somebody's losing blood pressure's going down. What is the body going to do? It's going to maintain homeostasis. It's going to beat faster and harder. Well, there's a problem here. We're losing blood. So we have to stop that to maintain homeostasis. And Walter Cannon also said, a disruption of homeostasis is the basis for disease and death. So we have to prevent that. One of the ways we do that is regulating our hormone levels and our happiness. If you go back to the literature, one of the ways that we regulate oxytocin, or happiness, and we produce oxytocin is from UVB, from light. And we know that one of the ways that light gets in and penetrates the brain is through the pineal gland. The pineal gland is a very bizarre little structure. It's right center in the middle of the brain. And light actually enters the cranium and actually enters through bone. I published this, 30 years ago. But we know, for example, here is an extinct toothed reptile called the Donocyclops, and you'll see a hole up there. It's called the pineal foramina. Light actually penetrates through that hole through presumably a heavy covered membrane, and it goes down into the pineal gland. And you see that in living reptiles, living amphibians. Here you see a Komodo dragon. It's kind of tough to tell by that figure. There's the pineal gland right there. It's actually further in the brain, but there's the pineal foramina right there. And if you go through the cultures, and if you read my weird paper that I published, I go through a lot of cultures, the Navajo Dene and the Australian Aborigines and various theological organizations. But you'll also notice very carefully, if you look at something like the Eastern ancient practices, Buddhism, Hinduism, Taoism, you'll notice if you go look at the statuaries, you'll see what they describe as the third eye, which is described as a perception beyond ordinary sight, enlightenment, and a seat of compassion. We've got UVB, we've got oxytocin, we've got happiness. And it's independently evolved throughout multiple cultures as an organization. You see that in the sun god Ra for the Egyptians. Now, when I wrote my textbook, I always made it a point I would never cite something if I didn't know where it came from. And one of the first things I realized is, boy, in the 1600s, the internet didn't exist. And these people didn't talk to each other. And so I learned a lot about the evolution of scientific thought. And I'm pretty sure the Egyptian hieroglyphics and the Greeks and the Middle Easterns didn't talk a whole lot. But they all came up with this idea that light somehow affected whatever that was, which we now know as oxytocin, and affected happiness. And René Descartes in 1643, he was an interesting character You may have recognized René Descartes. He said, cogito ergo sum, I am, therefore I think. I think he got it. Or no, he said, I think, therefore I am. I think he got it backwards. I am, therefore I think, but doesn't matter. He claimed in 1643 that the seat of the soul in compassion was in fact in the pineal, because as he claimed, no other animal had a pineal gland and no other animal had a soul. Now, as an evolutionary neuroanatomist, I can tell you, every vertebrate and every chordate we've ever looked at has a pineal. And it seems to me a touch egotistical to claim that no other animal has a soul. I mean, first of all, we can't really define what that means. So I'm going to suggest that empathy is very, very old, and it originates long before we ever came about. And does it go all the way back to microbiology and the bacteria? What if those bacteria were using oxytocin for cell-to-cell communication? Is it that big of a stretch to say that's not empathy and that's not sentience? I don't think it is. When we disturb homeostasis, whether it's ecological homeostasis, we cut down a tree. Let's restore ecological homeostasis by planting 2 more. And I think it's innate in the condition, not just with humans, but with the species as a whole. So what I realized was hate was kind of a booger to study. And in fact, I ran across this quote just a couple days ago. The science of hate is, quote, just an educated guess at this point. And my educated guess is it's the default. And there is a scientific basis for the neuroscientific and neurophysiological basis for caring and compassion. It is well documented, explained through the evolutionary history, predates the humans and the vertebrates. It's innate, and we're born to produce empathy. So to steal a much often thing, just do it. And to end, the final scene of my favorite movie of all time, 2001: A Space Odyssey. And that's the end. Thank you for your kindness.